All right. Welcome, everybody. This is the Dolphin Tank Project Consultation Learning Lab Part 5. So welcome. This is the 5th and final Conservation Finance Learning Lab. For folks who've joined us along the way, this 5-part series has covered timely topics with accessible, actionable information and insight for practitioners, whether including public funding, the use of debt, corporate partnerships, or leading today to our capstone Dolphin Tank Project workshop. I'm Lee Welpton, Executive Director of the Conservation Finance Network, where our fundamental business is to expand people's capacity, connections, and confidence to execute on conservation finance strategies and approaches in their work. And that is really about bridging sectors and silos to help people find the capital they need to advance the pace and scale of their efforts, whether that's public, private, nonprofit, academic, you name it. I want to share a word of thanks with my team. First and foremost, Julia Metler-Grove, our project and operations maven, and also Mary Powers, the newest member of our team, but a fearless forest finance associate extraordinaire. Also want to thank our many partners, colleagues, and friends who are joining us today or across other events in the canon. Next up, our partners, sharing a very generous thank you to the Highstead team, Tara, Jody, and colleagues who've enabled this partnership, this Learning Lab series. This is the 2nd year that we've done this together, and curious to get feedback from folks who've participated, but we think it's been kind of a real boon and something that's been quite worthwhile in exploring some current, timely, actionable insight on conservation finance tools and approaches. Highstead, I'll also note, is not just a partner on this webinar series, but also our partnership with the Yale Center for Business and the Environment. Looking forward to an impactful session together today. One last little note from the CFN perspective, we are gearing up for our 17th, if you can believe it, annual Conservation Finance Boot Camp, which will return to the Yale School of Environment this year from June 5th to 9th. The in-person application is unfortunately closed and the course is full from that perspective, but we will be live streaming select sessions from the course, which are open to all. And I'll ask my colleague, Julia, to help get the link to the virtual live stream in the chat. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tara.
Thanks, Lee. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Like Lee said, my name is Tara Whalen, and I'm the manager of conservation finance programs at Highstead. Thank you all so much for joining today and taking the time to hear from us and our panelists. Just a little bit of information about Highstead. We're a private operating foundation based in Connecticut and working throughout New England, dedicated to increasing the pace of land protection and advancing the stewardship of natural spaces. If you happen to have missed any of the previous sessions in this series, they're all available on Highstead's websites for you to visit and watch at any time that's convenient to you. And I'd also like to take a moment to thank some people who've been working behind the scenes to bring this together today. Thank you first and foremost to the panelists for being here and sharing their knowledge, as well as my team at Highstead and CFN for their continued support and collaboration. And lastly, my final thank you goes to Lee Welpton. Lee and her team have been great partners and leaders in the conservation finance space. So thanks, everyone, and I'll hand it back to Lee.
Thanks, Tara. And I'll just kind of start with a couple quick housekeeping points before we jump into the tank, as it were. One is that we are using the chat function for all questions, comments, things along that nature. So we can get that going now, and we can kind of continue throughout the sessions. If you have resources to share or ideas for our project presenters, don't be shy, throw those in the chat. If you have questions about something that comes up during the kind of discussion back and forth between the presenters and the Dolphin panel, also feel free to throw that in. If there's a funding source or a strategy you're less familiar with, we may have time at the end to be able to, after the project presentations, to get to those questions. As said, the session is being recorded for future distribution. And I'll also share, so this is our panel of Dolphin lineup, along with Tara here. And our Dolphin bios are available on our website. We won't get all into those now. but we'll have a direct link shared in the chat to where you can find those bios. We are joined, as this slide tells you, by Margaret Bowman, principal with Bowman Environmental Consulting, Jessamine Fitzpatrick, managing director at Alder Point Capital Management, Sean O'Rourke, director at Quantified Ventures, and I haven't seen Jill yet, but I think she might be joining us in just a minute here. Jill Azarski, program officer with the Walton Family Foundation.
I'm here, Lee. Can you guys not hear me?
Oh, I couldn't see you. That's the problem. For our little pre-huddle up there. Hi, Jill. Glad you could join us today. Jill is in fact with us. I can confirm that that was her voice, even though I still can't see her at the moment. All right. So just a little bit about the Dolphin tank model. So never thought in a million years we would use dolphin and porpoise terminology in our day-to-day work parlance, but here we are. This is a friendlier version of Shark Tank, if you will, modeled a bit after the types of pitches that are often made to different types of projects seeking capital that might be kind of adapting from the world of venture capital or others. But we thought, hey, this is a great model to get project feedback to kind of emerging approaches along conservation finance tools and strategies. So we've made it a little friendlier. It's dolphins, although they can still be a little nasty from what I hear, but friendlier than sharks at any rate. And our goal today is to, through two different sessions, a presentation, a discussion with the panel, another presentation, another discussion with the panel, to give some timely and actionable insight to our two project presentations. And those are incredibly interesting for today. We've got two projects lined up, both to do with, my interpretation at least, capturing a more full suite of benefits, or perhaps of balancing the benefits from the ecosystem services provided by certain project approaches for the benefit of social and ecological resilience. So we're going to kick things off with Eric Candela, Director of Local Government Relations at American Forests, and Seth Brown, the Vice President at Quantified Ventures, and their project, the Detroit Tree Equity Program. Once we're done with Eric and Seth, we'll move to Lashblin Dawson, the Nature Climate Solutions Manager with BirdLife Australia, but seeing as how, and his project on the Victorian Landscape Conservation Partnership and the Southwest Central Woodland Birds Program. We're going to give Lachlan a little mercy this morning. He's joining us at 4 a.m. local time in Melbourne, so he'll go second in the lineup. And in terms of what to expect, we'll have 12 minutes for each panel, each project, I should say, to present. We will be managing for time, but Eric and Seth, you've already been warned. And then followed by about 12 minutes for the dolphins to weigh in. So, shall we jump into the tank? Seth, Eric, we'll have you fellas take it away.
Sure, very good. While Seth is pulling up the PowerPoint, I'll just share that the Detroit Tree Equity Partnership is an initiative to reforest Detroit, leading, I guess I should say, by changing three paradigms of urban forestry. We're leading with equity. We're seeking to expand capacity by collaborating with myriad partners. And we're trying to monetize the benefits that trees provide. And so that's where we'll start today. And Seth, if you'd be so kind as to go to the next slide.
Give me 1 second here.
All right.
Is that showing the
title slide?
But is it showing the actual display, or is it showing like the display that I look at on the second monitor? Is it showing it in full screen?
Yes, it's showing it in full screen.
Nailed it. All right, thanks.
All right, so now we're on to the next one. American Forests coined the term tree equity to refer to the fact that in reality, the distribution of trees is not equitable. What you're looking at here is a map of Rhode Island. On the left is the tree canopy, and on the right is a heat map, and you'll see that the two are virtually the inverse of the other. And so the neighborhoods where people could most benefit from trees are the ones that are least likely to have them. And this is more than, a theoretical or, academic exercise. If you'll go to the next slide, Seth, you'll see opposite sides of Woodward Avenue in the city of Detroit. Woodward is the first paved road in America. It leads north-south from the very waterfront in Detroit all the way up to Pontiac. And so you can see that the problem is, as real as the difference between neighborhoods across a 5 or 10 lane road there. And so next slide. With diminishing canopy come naturally diminishing public health, environmental, and economic benefits. And by investing in trees, we hope to improve outcomes associated with each of those. Next slide, please. Our value proposition, if you will, is to attract and invest $35 million roughly over a 5-year period to plant 75,000 trees in neighborhoods throughout Detroit. And in the process to train and employ Detroit residents who face barriers to employment for full-time permanent employment in the tree care industry. And so in a nutshell, that's what we're doing and why we're doing it. And Seth is going to speak to the financing research and models that we're exploring.
So that's where I come in. So 5 years, 75,000 trees, $35 million. That's our 5-year pilot. And what we want to really try and figure out is how we can have sustainable funding sources so that the pilot can actually scale to actually move the needle in Detroit beyond this 75,000 trees and get to Eric, what's the level that they're trying to get to? How many 100,000?
At a very minimal level, Detroit needs 416,000 trees and as many as 1.2 million.
So put that in your back of your mind too. So like
Seth, you froze. But we are putting that in the back of our minds. Eric, do you want to keep going?
It's kind of hard when we're stuck on the slide here.
All right, I can text Seth. Well, you want to share a little bit more about the project?
The one thing I'll say is that in 2016, a street tree inventory was completed for the city of Detroit, and it found that the trees were generally ill-suited to the urban environment, poorly diversified, and I can't remember the third, but in deteriorating condition. And so if nothing is done, the city is going to continue to lose canopy. So much so that we did a little study that showed that if climate remains the same and nothing is done to improve canopy, the amount of stormwater runoff in Detroit increases by 900 million gallons a year after 10 years.
Eric, I'm back on, by the way.
Yep.
Okay. Well, that was great timing. For the 20 minutes I was online before I had to talk, I wasn't frozen. And then the 1 minute I started, I was. So I appreciate your patience as that resets. And just please let me know if my internet ends up going out again. Washington, D.C. internet. What can I tell you? Eric, you were kind of highlighting, I wanted to take 2 points. One of which is we're trying to fund a pilot, right? This $35 million, 75,000 trees. But from the framework of, can we create sustainable flows of capital towards this thing, not only so that Detroit could get to the 400,000 trees that they want to be able to do, but also so that American forests can replicate this in other cities. And we've got tools in our toolkit to make that happen. So what we'll talk a little bit is Detroit specific and pilot specific, but also have a lens associated with, well, what are the tools out there that may work even if they don't work in Detroit? And so we want to keep some of that in mind because there's a lot of lessons that we've learned, and this isn't the only landscape of which we'll be trying to address tree inequities through the tree equity program and partnership. I think I'm preaching to the choir when we talk about what a robust tree canopy cover can provide in terms of benefits. Lee, I thought you set the stage well when you were saying that there's a holistic benefits and how are we trying to get the suite of ecosystem services that they provide able to be funded. What I'll do is I'm going to have a slide that shows the benefits. I'm going to have a slide that shows a little bit of the discounted cash flows over a 5-year period, which totals $35 million when you discount it, is roughly 22 million or so, and then go into what sources of funding we've identified thus far that we're pursuing, with the caveat of what sources have worked well, what sources haven't, and then what innovative, maybe potentially like tax credit models can be used to try and pull into this program and the challenges that we have surrounding that.
Seth, I know you talk fast, but I want to give you a 5-minute warning for all of that.
Okay, perfect. So, guys, environmental benefits, there's climate benefits associated with carbon sequestration. We highlighted the disparities associated with heat island effect. There's the water stormwater management benefits. Because this isn't being done as like a benevolent dictator that's just throwing trees on the ground, and we're being targeted with neighborhoods and we're being targeted with employment, there's all kinds of employment benefits and social benefits associated with it. And then lastly, there's the public health associated with robust tree canopy cover, respiratory disease, asthma reduction, all kinds of benefits. So the question is, can we take these benefits, match them to payers and beneficiaries, and make it work? So this is a high level takeaway. The big takeaway here is that if you discount the cash flows out, we're looking at a negative NPV associated with identified sources of 22 million thus far. One thing I want to highlight here is it's 4 areas of work. We have the administration, that's managing the 3 other areas, but there's the tree planting work, actually putting trees in the ground, doing procurement, identifying where they're going. There's the workforce training and placement program, so recruitment, training, and placement. And then there's the community engagement side. All of that put together is where you get into this robust partnership. I will say that no matter what we can do on conservation finance, there's going to be some public subsidy that's required. So we're going to need federal and state and local resources and some philanthropic sources. Our frame of work is how can we pull in the ecosystem services and other benefits as a way of supplementing public funding, justifying public funding, or looking at the outcomes as a way to incentivize philanthropy to contribute to the project. So what does that mean in terms of public funding and where we're going for? So I think you guys are pretty aware that the Inflation Reduction Act is a game changer, and so is the bipartisan infrastructure law. The Inflation Reduction Act provides $1.5 billion for community forestry through the U.S. Forest Service. We believe that there's a pocket of money that can support programs like this, and we believe we're well positioned for them. And when Senator Stabenow was announcing the impacts associated with the Inflation Reduction Act, it was announced in Detroit in partnership with this program. So that's really exciting. We've got a multi-year commitment from the city of Detroit, from the city of Detroit's Public Works Department for $500,000 a year. And just like inside baseball politics, the House in Michigan is now flipped to Democrats, which has made it to where the urban rural kind of tension that goes in most states, Detroit is at the center back into the power. And so there's an opportunity for the state house to be supporting projects like this as well. So we've got eyes of sight from the federal opportunities that are available, the city, and then the state in the middle. American Forest has been really working hard on Detroit businesses, and we've been working with DTE and Blue Cross and Blue Shield on supporting this. And then what we're looking at in terms of ecosystem services is the carbon potential, primarily working with partners like city forest credits. Carbon for urban projects has a lot of constraints, especially associated with public ownership versus private ownership, what kinds of protections you have on them. But City Forest Credits has been a pretty strong partner and been able to do this in multiple cities and even do this with American Forests. Based on our modeling, that provides roughly $3 million in free cash flow to the project. Before I get into new markets tax credits, I want to talk about some areas where we were unsuccessful, or at least unsuccessful in Detroit. So first and foremost was on stormwater. We know that planting trees has a massive stormwater retention benefit and stormwater management benefit. But the Detroit Water and Sewer Department doesn't view trees, especially baby trees, as a intervention to try and manage stormwater. They also don't have any difference between a grassy knoll and a grassy knoll with trees on it, meaning that it's either impervious or pervious, and they don't really care what the makeup is, the vegetation that's there. They don't have a method of trying to compensate that. And so while we've been working with Detroit Water and Sewer, we've been unable to make it to where stormwater credits is something that we can take into our financial model. We do think that there could be an avenue in engaging them through the new markets tax credit transaction, which I'll talk more about in a second. We were unsuccessful to be able to get job creation outcome payments, in part because of the complex relationship associated with labor and union jobs, and how we're trying to get the causal pipeline associated with going from our program into the apprenticeship program and getting in there. But we do believe there is opportunity here, in particular for tree crews that are outside of the city. The utility has to pay usually a per diem to have people come from out of state because there isn't enough people in the city to be able to actually do the work. And so if we can alleviate that pressure, we believe there's value. And then lastly,
Seth, just coming in to tell you 12 minutes are up, but since we had a little connection here, if you want to jump into any specific questions for the Dolphins.
Yeah, I guess my biggest thing is around taking some things off the table, which is that the city of Detroit's not going to be issuing a bond or going into debt for this project. One of the things we're really exploring is leveraging new markets tax credits. And with the new markets tax credits, we would be able to get a subsidy about $3 million. But the constraint is around operating capital versus large scale upfront capital deployment. So this tree planting program is going to have a heavy operating capital requirement on an annual basis, year to year to year, as opposed to doing a large scale building where it's an upfront capital and then your operating costs go down over time. I mean, your capital expenditure goes down over time. Have you guys done any projects where ongoing maintenance or ongoing massive capital requirements are a big part of the project, rather than upfront investments in terms of acquisitions or buildings?
Anything else there?
Yeah, that was just my question for the Dolphins.
Okay, so is that the end?
Give me my 12-minute warning. Apologize.
All right, great. So now we're going to invite, we've got our Dolphins popping in here to react and respond. Who wants to kick us off? Margaret, can I put you on the spot?
I was about to give up an answer since no one else was going to go first. Thanks for the presentation. I'm really excited you're doing this. I think, tree equity is a fabulous program, and Detroit is a perfect place to be testing this out. I have to say, you were starting the presentation and I was all excited that Quantified has finally figured out how to monetize stormwater credits. So Seth, you deeply disappointed me by the end.
Sorry.
But I think the ongoing operations and maintenance issue is a really big one. It is much more, that is the cost of maintaining trees. It's not hard to plant them. It's hard to keep them alive. And that's where the employment benefit comes in. I have not seen yet a good financing solution for that. But it is, I think new markets tax credit is an interesting way of looking at that. I think talking to the Economic Development Authority that is really trying to do a lot more innovative work these days may be an interesting way of getting some of the federal infrastructure money in place for that, and using somehow with EDA, could you figure out how to link those jobs to the ongoing O&M? May be a way. I'm not sure it's an income generating than a justification for ongoing federal resources.
Yeah, like cost alleviation or something, right? Yeah.
Right. But EDA may be a place you want to look. The Milken Institute, that's doing a lot on infrastructure financing, has been working very closely with EDA, so they may be an interesting into EDA for that. Otherwise, I don't know if FEMA was on your list, but FEMA might be an interesting agency to be partnering with as well, because of you're increasing the resilience. The economic cost of the stormwater issues in Detroit has gotten so significant that you may be able to be using FEMA BRIC funding for that as well. Again, more federal handouts than income generating solutions. And then I think increasingly, if you can frame this as a nature-based solution, there's increasing interest in foundations for approaching urban tree planting, and Bezos Earth Fund to ranging from Bezos Earth Fund to some of the from Hewlett, some of the more water-oriented funders are interested in figuring out how to address that and linking in the water. And then when you add the health in, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, Kresge, some of those may be interested. Some of those have investment arms who may be able to give you a long-term loan, particularly Robert Wood Johnson and Kresge, and may be able to, help lean into monetizing stormwater and jobs and operation and maintenance, and be interested in being very experimental there.
Really helpful.
Yep.
An example from my days in Rhode Island that may be useful here, and Eric worked with some of your American Forest colleagues on this in its early days, and then we kind of operationalized the concept into the infrastructure bank. It isn't a revenue generating model, but it's a way of expanding the potential to use more money for trees. And it was using regulatory compliance issues with the Department of Transportation for Clean Water Act violations. And they bonded it was like $100 million over 10 years to do stormwater related work that was coming off of state-owned roadways. And we started to run the numbers with the Department of Transportation as we were trying to push for more and better nature-based solutions, green infrastructure work, instead of just, more traditional gray infrastructure along the sides of roadways. And what we found is that we could start to change procurement models for how these systems were built. So if Department of Transportation over, say, a year was going to spend $10 million in investments in stormwater related activities, take that $10 million, partner with a local trusted organization, and have them do the procurement, and have, instead of the procurement coming from the state, we're saving about 33% on all of the projects, because we didn't have to go through the state gauntlet in order to get this funding done. So it was like basically a grant or charter from the state to the local entity to then procure this design services, implementation services locally. They could then use that funding to not only implement, but also set up long-term maintenance partnerships as well, to be able to actually care for these as a community-based resource by paying local constituents to actually maintain the projects over a long period of time. So we're seeing a 33% savings, not again revenue generating, but it overall goes to the overall benefit by saving money over time. The other idea that came up too is looking at the capital improvement plans. There's been some examples nationally of using CIPs and future anticipated budget allocations. I know you talked about not wanting to take on debt. We're looking at, say, a 5-year CIP process and actually bonding against the potential future revenues of those CIPs to present value that now, knowing that more and greater value is going to come from projects that are done now than in 5 years. So trying to bring as much of that value forward as possible could be another way to look.
Good idea.
I'll just jump in with a question first comment, then a question. This is Jill Ozarski. First, I love the location of this because I'm a Detroit native, so thank you. Yeah, I will always be a Detroiter, even though I've lived outside the state longer than I lived there. But anyway, I am really interested in, you guys are right at the intersection of so much of the natural infrastructure funding that is available right now through the various federal programs that have been enabled. And I didn't hear what programs you were pursuing. I just heard like this talk about federal infrastructure dollars, but have you, which agencies are you pursuing, or have you thought about that part yet? I mean, I'm sure you have, but just which ones? Because I'm interested in the financing piece, but like right now, there's this strange, unique circumstance where the financing isn't as, we might not need to finance because there's government dollars coming. And I'm thinking particularly about like EPA programs and US Forest Service programs for this. But have you gone down that road already?
So we gotta get there. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, the big one that we're kind of holding out for is from the Forest Service for urban forestry funding. We expect the NOFO literally any day now. And insofar as Senator Stabenow requested the funding in the IRA. She attended our opening kickoff event with the Undersecretary Homer Wilkes. So we feel like we're well positioned in that sense. And then our strategy would be, once we have that funding, kind of secure and in place, to pursue some other sources, and including a state appropriation and EPA funding and the like.
That's the biggest one. Is the 1.5 billion is like tailor-made for this program. And the question on how much we can get is outstanding, but we think that if we were able to get a substantial source, like call it 15 or 20 million, and then the state was able to come in with an appropriation, we're in a pretty good position.
Yeah, because I was thinking, I don't have a copy on your slide, but that 500 million a year or 500,000 a year that you got from the city, I think it was, like that could be your O&M if that's possible, if you can have the upfront capital from grant funding.
Yeah, but the upfront capital isn't so like every year you're doing roughly 7 or 8 million of tree planting and job training. So it's not like I'm building a building and then I've got a few $100,000 every year I got to cover in capital expense. Every year I'm back on the wheel of how do I get 7 million in the door. And it's kind of complicated because like on the new markets tax credit component, they don't like having new markets tax credit transactions sit on cash. So we can only do like 2 years of operating budget through the new markets tax credit. We get a 20% subsidy. And it's just like a challenge that every year you're literally trying to figure out how you can appropriate this in some ways, right? It's how do I alleviate some pressure associated with carbon credits and stormwater and maybe other opportunities that are there, but in reality, you're going to need line of sight on getting local government and philanthropy to pay millions of dollars on an annual basis to make it flow.
Well, the local philanthropy, speaking from the philanthropy circles right now, they love leverage. So if you can show that's where the need is, it's not the capital, but it's the O&M over time, and you're covering the capital costs through some of those grants. That's just, and I'm sure you're thinking of this, but it's just a way to stack the capital.
One thing we're thinking about trying to go to, the Kresge's of the world is in a new markets tax credit transaction, you have a leverage lender, and then you've got tax credit equity that goes into it. And you need the repayment of the leverage lender to be like real line of sight associated with how you're going to be able to repay the debt. Even though after 7 years, it kind of all dissolves, meaning you're going to have a 7-year interest only payment. And then at the end, the principal is kind of forgiven. In order to get into the tax compliance to get the new markets tax credits, you need to have line of sight on how you're paying principal plus interest over like a 20-year amortization. And we think that there could be a cool relationship there to go directly to local philanthropy of like, can you be the loan guarantor that unlocks the new markets tax credit? In the end, in 7 years, this is all going to dissolve. But like, we need to be above board tax wise to show that we've got line of sight on it. And then conversely, could we go to like the water and sewer department in the Blue Cross and Blue Shields and be like, we know we're not going to have like an outcomes based attribution associated with ER visits or maybe a stormwater credit, but we got the 7-year window of how we're doing this new markets tax credit transaction. Can we put you on the hook to support it financially for 5 years or 6 years? And it'd be like a discrete thing that they're funding out of a different pocket than they would, if it's philanthropic. But that's what I want to run after in the next quarter or so.
If I can respond to that, first of all, the guarantees, I think the foundations are perfectly set up to do that. Kresge established a national guarantee pool that several foundations have established for a variety of issues. And the woman who set it up for Kresge now runs the investment work at Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And so I think they'd be very interested in exploring a guarantee. And I think this is a good place for that. So I think that's one piece. And I had another thought for you. I do think it's interesting, using the new markets tax credit to kind of crowd in the health and the water department to cover certain expenses over time. I'm stating the obvious, but affordability is such a huge issue in Detroit that adding any debt is a non-starter. But if you can link it to annual payments and be able to demonstrate how much they're saving, and so that they can sell this to their ratepayers, is we are actually alleviating funding by putting this in and framing it that way. Of this extra payment is avoided cost. I think that's the way you're going to be able to frame that to Detroit Water and Sewer. They are obsessed with that.
Margaret, I bring a kind of a layman's understanding to this. It seems like the water department's objection to what you just suggested would be that those savings will occur so far in the future that, we're unwilling to think about them now. Do you have some suggestion for how we could address that objection?
I guess I would first of all make those savings as concrete as you can make them and demonstrate the size of them, and explain that it's not that different than in investing in a large project today that isn't going to be completed for a certain amount of years. See if you can create an analogy to something gray, because water utilities don't like to color outside the lines. To the extent you can make an analogy to something that's that they do already, and they're very comfortable committing to some big gray infrastructure project that's going to take 10-15 years to complete. So I would try that analogy, but I think it's just giving them the numbers and then finding strategic people within the city that will endorse you.
Okay, that's good advice. Thank you.
We are coming up to time, so I wanted to just kind of collect any other thoughts from across our illustrious pod.
Yeah, great presentation. Thank you so much, and really an inspiring project. I had a couple of questions. So one question I had was about the carbon element and whether that $3 million estimated funding source was ongoing or a one-time.
It's ongoing. That's the sum of the cash flows over the 26-year period.
I see. So it's like the present value of those cash flows over the project life.
Yeah.
So a relatively small amount relative to what you would need. Yeah. I was just wondering if maybe that could help with the NMTC piece, but
it can, and that's actually like a big source of repayment. The challenge there is the lumpiness of it, meaning that they're distributed in, like, I'm making it up, but it's like 6, 10, 14, and then like 26 years. But having a contract that would say we have the rights to the carbon over that life of 26 years might be enough to say that we have stable revenue streams that are longer than the debt service we're taking on.
And then my other question, just something to think about, was about the scale of the project, and understanding that it's a pilot needs to be of compelling scale to leverage sort of replicability elsewhere and maybe even within Detroit. But thinking about what parts of the budget, so to speak, are sort of fixed and what parts are more flexible, and why, I guess my question was, and maybe this is a question just to be prepared to answer off the bat, why this is the right scale for this project. And I think a related question is whether some of these funding sources are based on that scale. So for example, like I assume the carbon revenues scale, the degree of the carbon revenues would scale with the degree of the number of trees planted, but would the NMTC funding source also scale because it's a percentage of the project?
Yeah, it does.
And so on and so forth. Yeah.
For the back of the envelope on NMTC, and it's like fun for those who don't know it, 39% of the project cost can be sold as tax credits. When you cut out all of the transaction costs and fees, you're left with anywhere from like 20 to 25% of the project cost, but it does scale. And so the value is actually the larger you can make your project, the more you get tax credits.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is you could take grant money, like appropriations from the state or this money from the Forest Service, and then flow it through the new markets tax transaction to boost the project cost.
Well, I think we need to stop there so that we can get to our next project, but I just want to say a very heartfelt thank you to the Dolphins for some really great feedback and comments on this front, and also especially to Eric and Seth for the bravery that it takes to hop into the tank and present a project from your work. So thank you all. Seth, Eric, we do have a recording of this section which will be made available so that you can listen back to some of the comments. We know it's not fair to ask you to take notes while you're also presenting. But we're going to get our next project started. Let's see, there we go. Lachlan, I think you're going to be sharing your own slides, correct?
Yes, so I've just started sharing now. Hopefully you can see it.
All right, same rules apply. I'll give you a warning before time, but about 12 minutes, and we'll let you take it away.
Okay, great. Thank you, Lee. And thank you all very much for having me. It's a great opportunity for me to draw on your collective experience, and so I really appreciate it. I'd also like to acknowledge before I start that I'm coming to you all from Boon Wurrung country of the Eastern Kulin Nation. Pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. So, as Lee mentioned earlier, I'm Lachlan. I'm the Nature Climate Solutions Manager at BirdLife Australia. So I'm working out of Melbourne, Victoria. And my role is to explore how BirdLife Australia can get involved with the growing opportunities in the nature-based solution space. And so that includes the carbon and biodiversity markets and how the new funding available there can be pulled into the conservation that we're doing for Australia's native birds. So the project I'm talking to you today about is the Victorian Landscape Conservation Partnership. So it's part of the Southwest Central Woodland Birds program, and its overarching vision there down at the bottom is to achieve healthy, connected woodland habitat, thriving with birds and engaging people. Who we are and who's involved in the Victorian Landscape Conservation Partnership. So VLCP is a unique collaboration of 6 organisations across Australia. BirdLife Australia and Bush Heritage Australia, they're at the top, are the co-leaders of the partnership, which means we share project coordination and revenue raising responsibilities. I'll give you a quick overview of each of the partners and what we bring to the table. BirdLife Australia is Australia's largest bird conservation organisation. So we develop targeted preventing extinction action plans for key threatened species, and then we develop conservation and restoration projects on the ground. Our base of citizen science supporters is what really sets us apart from the other conservation organisations. We've got networks of keen bird watchers across Australia that visit our sites, collect data for us in their spare time, and work with us to track and maximise our impact across our projects. Bush Heritage Australia, moving on, specialises in buying, safeguarding and managing conservation reserves to protect our native species forever. They're a huge organisation across Australia. They're currently managing over 11 million hectares of conservation reserves. Moving on to Udinata, they're really passionate about new solutions for saving threatened species. So they're working with landholders through the VLCP project. They're going to teach them about natural capital on their property, how they can be positive stewards of their land while also supporting their business long term. Zoos Victoria are a conservation-based zoo, and they have species-specific conservation expertise that they're bringing to the table to help us target our focus species. Greening Australia are our planting partner, and so they specialise in planting diverse range of native species and keeping them alive as well. And then Trust for Nature specialise in setting up covenants with private landholders so they can protect habitat on their property. That's everyone. Let me dive into the project in a little bit more detail. The project area for VLCP covers around 47,000 kilometres in southwest central Victoria, and a substantial area of that is temperate woodland habitat. This is a heavily agricultural area, so moving away from the urban environment in Detroit, and has clearly been significantly cleared for agriculture since European colonization. And so habitat loss is a key challenge for native woodland dependent bird species in the region. And then climate change is also a key challenge that species are going to be facing in the future. It's only going to become more of an issue moving forwards. It's a key opportunity for us to work in this region. Our partners are strongly involved already in the local area, have good inroads into the local community, and we also have good technical capability to lead the revegetation and restoration space in the area. The guiding goal for the VLCP project is that by 2040, population trajectories of at least 7 focal species of woodland birds are improved through conserving, restoring, and expanding habitat in that project region. And so what are we going to do to achieve that? Our project activities by 2040 is to covenant a total of 9,000 hectares, protecting good habitat that's there already, and then restoring and revegetating 4,000 hectares of habitat. This will also be accompanied by community engagement to empower landholders to protect and restore biodiversity on their own properties, hoping to create a snowballing effect so we don't have to do all the work, but just get it started. And then a real central part of this project is, from our point of view, exploring innovative funding methods for establishing and supporting conservation projects long-term. So this is where connecting this work with the carbon markets comes in. And for us, this is really a test case for what model works best, working on private land with landholders to restore nature using the new markets and new funding opportunities that might be available. As a quick overview of the project as a whole, now we'll dive into the finance side of things. This is where it gets a little bit more interesting. The total project running to 2040, you can see there the total budget is $35 million USD over those 17 years spent out across that 2040 lifespan. What I wanted to focus on today was the pilot funding budget. So $6 million spent from 2024 to 2026 to support all of the on-ground project action. You can see a category breakdown of how we're going to be spending that, but it's cut across conservation and restoration. So out of that total protection and restoration targets, we'll be protecting 1,800 hectares and restoring 800 hectares across the pilot. It'll cost around $3.5 million. Then we've got costs for maintenance, monitoring, and community engagement as well. So $6 million total is what we're shooting for in that pilot phase. And now we get into the funding gap. So $6 million to support all the project activity across the pilot. Carbon credits, similar to the Detroit work, is a key opportunity for us to pull some funding into the project. And so you can see if we're using the native reforestation method, we're forecasting around $2 million in funding is available there. And so that leaves a $4 million USD gap. So that's the problem I'm bringing forward today. If we rely on carbon credits, we've got this gap, and it's because we're planning to maximize benefits for biodiversity. So we're not just planning to maximize our carbon yield. And there are 2 key factors that makes this funding gap so large. Our project area in that South Central Victoria region is the perfect place to restore habitat for biodiversity, but it's not ideal for growing trees for carbon. Trees grow slower in the region. As a result, they store less carbon per year than they could in other areas. The other reason is to maximize the biodiversity benefits for our plantings. We're not just planting tree species to maximize carbon yield. And so key issue with some carbon projects at the moment is that they focus on maximizing carbon yield and plant monocultures of the same species to achieve that. And we'll be planting a diverse range of native tree species as well as shrubs to create ecologically rich habitat for our target woodland bird species. And so the key question for me is, are there traditional or non-traditional funding avenues that really jump to mind that could pair well with our funding from the carbon market to fill that $4 million funding gap? And so I pulled together a couple of different scenarios of what we could do to fill this gap. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on it at the end, noting ideally that we don't want this project to pull on funding from traditional sources. So we could, and we will probably at the end of the day, do some fundraising together, fundraising campaigns across the 6 organizations that are involved, but we'd really rather to pull in money from new locations and not just rely on these existing opportunities. So scenario 1, we've got the $2 million coming in from the carbon credits. And then we've also got a 2 million potential opportunity from government grants and philanthropic loans as a potential scenario. So our government set ambitious goals to hold extinction at a federal level. It's likely that more public funding will be made available to support landholders to restore habitat on their property. It's a risk, and it's not ideal to be waiting instead of finding other avenues to source that money, but that is an opportunity moving forwards. Philanthropic loans was something that I picked out of an earlier episode of the Conservation Finance Network seminars, actually. And I thought it was an interesting way to potentially unlock more capital from major donors that otherwise wouldn't be available, instead of asking them for a direct donation, saying we can return this capital to you in the future through the work that we're doing. So that's the first scenario. And scenario 2 was more revolving around ecosystem services. And so a lot more on the edge of the emerging ecosystem markets. We've got 2 million from the carbon credit space still, and then also looking at water basin benefits and biodiversity benefits. Water basin benefits, similar to stormwater credits that Seth talked about previously, could come from working with a partner like Waterplan. So I think they're based out of California. Waterplan work with corporates on the corporate side of things to calculate the company's exposure to water risk in their business model, and then mitigating that risk in the water basin that company works in through nature-based solutions like planting trees. And so the idea is that we would stack those water basin benefits on top of the carbon credits because of the tree planting work that we'll be doing. In a similar way, we can explore biodiversity credits and biodiversity benefits from corporates looking to demonstrate their nature positive standing to their stakeholders. We understand with the emergence of frameworks like the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosure, there may be growing appetite for private companies to measure and report and then reduce in the future their impact on nature over time. And that might open the door for a biodiversity benefits market. So already in Australia, we're seeing a few initiatives set up a framework to allow this to happen. BirdLife Australia itself are actually partnering to develop a bird community condition metric that will provide a science-based way to measure the change in bird population health as a result of restoration projects, and being able to measure that opens the door for trusted biodiversity credits in the future. So those were the possible pathways forwards, and really my key questions coming out of that are there other mechanisms that we could take advantage of in this space that have jumped to mind as I've gone through that? Are there different approaches to those mechanisms listed that we could explore? And are there innovative ways to blend traditional finance with the more novel mechanisms that we discussed at the end? So appreciate any thoughts. That's everything from me. I look forward to hearing questions, comments, or feedback.
Excellent work, Lachlan. Great presentation. You were actually a minute under as the case were, which is expertly managed for time. So we're bringing back our dolphins, and I can let one of you offer up a first reaction or comment. Or I can cold call on one of you to start it off.
I'll go first again. You guys all owe me. Lachlan, thank you for that presentation. I'm particularly appreciative of it since I'm a bird watcher. So any presentation that's got pretty birds in it, I'm very happy, and especially one that is conserving habitat. I think I'm happy to see how you're trying to kind of break this down and take it in smaller chunks. I think your philanthropic loan idea is an intriguing one. Of course, you may have to increase the amount you borrow, since you're really probably going to be paying that off through the carbon credits, because that's where your revenue stream is. So keep that in mind when you kind of break off the chunks. I think the water plant, water benefits and the biodiversity benefits, you're really basically talking about voluntary markets there. And I think you have some opportunity there. They're slow growing markets. I think you're going to have to probably focus on your domestic market for that, not any international market. But if you can quantify clearly the water savings and the by, the increase in biodiversity is a little easier. If you can quantify it and try to sell it to your corporate leaders in the state, there is potential for that. If you want to kind of talk to an organization that's been doing that pretty successfully in the United States, Bonneville Environmental Foundation, that's funded by Walton Family Foundation, has been doing quite a bit of that on water credits, water supply credits in the American West to a decent end. It's not huge amounts of money, but I think you could probably get a couple $1 million a year out of that. I also think the piece that I would kind of add in here is, how do you market this to the birding community? And how much can you raise with, biodiversity credits and others to your local bird guide companies and any, local birding equipment or whatever, and find something that's linked to the benefit that you have and really try to draw that link, because what you're doing is growing birds. And so can you use a voluntary market there that includes a whole lot of PR for those in the birding industry, as it would be. So I'll stop there.
That's great. Thank you, Margaret. Those are all great ideas.
I believe Sean, Jill, and Jessamine are still processing, but Jill came off mute for 2 seconds.
I was trying to break the trend of Margaret and then me, but I just wanted to acknowledge that I don't have as much understanding of the international side. So apologies, Lachlan, but gosh, I love that part of the world. But the one thing I wanted to tear off of that Margaret mentioned is the birding community. Is I did wonder if that's a way to potentially, if you can figure out how to monetize that, then that's your repayment of loans you may need. If you can figure out how to monetize increased birding, or if there's like highly oversimplifying the work you do, but if any of your groups do, could start doing tours or something that would be revenue generating over time, that would help capture some of that revenue to help pay off like a philanthropic loan over time. And the one other thing that was triggering in my head, and I'm not as familiar with Australia, but I did work in New Zealand 8 years ago now, and several of the corporations there that are well connected with the New Zealand government, I'm thinking particularly of New Zealand Air, have a very strong partnership with their conservation organizations where there's corporate donations and flow that are available because that's a way of capturing the tourism dollars that are coming in as well. I don't know if that's as applicable in Australia, but it was very relevant in New Zealand. New Zealand Air was hugely connected to a lot of the work that Department of Conservation does in New Zealand.
Yeah, it's a really good idea. Thanks, Jill.
Lachlan, thanks for the presentation and great comments from Jill and Margaret for sure. I was wondering if this might be an opportunity to partner with sort of so-called project developers who are starting to work around biodiversity credit markets and maybe water. And I'm thinking about sort of, I don't know, maybe a decade ago here in the US, the carbon market was relatively nascent, and there were a handful of carbon project developers who were really interested in getting these markets going. And so they were willing to work on projects like this on maybe a loss leader kind of a perspective. And since biodiversity markets are relatively new or nascent compared to where the carbon market is today, or here in the US, the wetland mitigation market, I just wonder if there are folks who are kind of in the entrepreneurial sphere who would be good partners for you, and maybe they even have private capital behind them that's looking more for a long-term profit. That could be a way to partner on this pilot level and then maybe scale up over time.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great idea as well. There are a couple of organizations that spring to mind straight off the bat that are exploring more in depth than everyone else on the biodiversity side of things. They've got a couple of pilots up and running. So pulling them into the work that we're doing could be a great opportunity.
Lachlan, really interesting project, and thanks for bringing it to us. Piggybacking on a couple of the other comments here, this is really not my wheelhouse, so apologies for not a lot of in-depth comments, but sort of on the process side, heard a lot of times about kind of breaking this project down. These emerging new pilot projects, there's not a lot of kind of blueprint. And I think the kind of the case of kind of an object in motion stays in motion is really true with a lot of these. So starting to have these small wins so you can start to build momentum that others will join you in this, I think is really key. And so instead of going after 6 million as one chunk, bringing it into a few different pots to show that you have a village going along, I think is a really good way of tackling this. And so I would just encourage you to continue to look for all of the kind of funding and financing quilt opportunities with this. It's not going to be easy. There's no one silver bullet. It's really like the kind of silver buckshot here. So I would really kind of think about, what are the early pieces you can start to chip away at? And I think then the larger pieces will come.
Yeah, that's a really great point, Sean. And especially when we're looking at access to land as well. That's another thing that we'll be grappling with in the future, being able to show people that we've got these early wins at the start will continue to get them excited about being involved just from a landholder point of view. So yeah, definitely agree.
Lachlan, one of the other things I forgot to mention is that this issue that you raise of, carbon credits need to maximize carbon, and how do you balance that with biodiversity? I think that's something that the foundation world is increasingly worried about, and I think some of the, starting to kind of question the carbon markets and the like. And so there may be some interest in supporting, your design and some early science to be able to document, like, how much carbon are we losing to maximize biodiversity, and how do you try to balance that? I think that's an area that is of an increasing interest. And this, rather than maximizing carbon, how do you optimize both carbon and biodiversity so that you are actually getting nature, not, a tree farm? So there may be some, that you may want to kind of pitch that to foundations on the grant side, not just the loan side, as something that you could get some of the early money to do the science around it, of course.
That's a great point, Margaret. And I would add water in there too. I mean, I think people talk about carbon and co-benefits, but obviously lots of concerns about what gets lost. And this idea of trying to quantify the co-benefits, to me, seems like it would be relatively leading and addressing a need that the foundations probably are looking for guidance on.
Yeah,
that's a really great point. And it's a way to phrase that story that I hadn't thought about before. We're a science-based organization, so we have been really excited about being able to look at the difference in the biodiversity benefits from our plantings versus a normal carbon planting. But it's a really great opportunity to talk with the carbon developers as well and talk about balancing that on their side of things too. So yeah, thank you.
A lot of raising money for this and financing this is going to be framing it differently for different audiences. How do you frame it for those that want to, try to balance, carbon markets and other markets? How do you look at it from people who really care about the birds, and just what are your different framings, and how do you find revenue out of all of those?
Well, we have just a minute or two left if there are any other comments. I do wonder, Lachlan, what the kind of corporate side, you've got probably all of the very significantly engaged private land conservation NGOs, or even, is Bush Heritage also an NGO? You've got such an incredible mix of partners across the spectrum there. I wonder, have you explored anything to do with corporate engagement, corporate sponsorship around any of the variables, water, birding, for whether it's more of the corporate sustainability KPIs or for some of the kind of social license to operate that they may be needing from a group like yours?
Yeah, it's something we've thought about, but we haven't dived into actually doing that corporate engagement yet. In terms of, would they just be interested in funding the project for the project's sake, like you say, to increase the the stakeholder awareness of the good stuff that they're doing in the local community. So yeah, it's definitely a good opportunity that we'll look at.
I mean, Margaret spoke to that in the context of Bonneville, but I do think, given what little we understand about the Australian conservation finance movement, there is a little more interest and momentum perhaps among kind of corporate entities, especially those that are having to report to global audiences, and everything that we're learning about how the sustainability reporting index has shifted very rapidly in the last few years.
Yeah, definitely. And I think a lot of people have been sitting on their hands while that reporting index is developed a little bit further. And now like version 4 of TNFD just came out recently. So probably starting to get in motion.
Well, we're just at time. So I just want to give a last chance for any of our dolphins to chime in with a final word, or perhaps word of wisdom or encouragement, as the case may be. All right, then it sounds like, oh, Margaret came off mute.
I was just gonna wish you good luck, Lachlan. I think it's an exciting project.
Thank you, Margaret. I appreciate it. And thank you to all the dolphins for your innovative ideas. It's really good to be able to put the project forward to you and hear what you think, even though you're outside the Australian context. Drawing on your experience is really valuable for us. So I appreciate your time.
Well, I'm sure no one would mind an invitation to come bird watching at the project site. So just plant that seed for everyone's benefit.
Sounds good.
Excellent. Well, kind of at that conclusion, we may have just a minute or two. I don't know if any of the dolphins, having seen two projects that are both really trying to understand the balance of ecosystem services alongside or outside of kind of carbon revenues, the most monetizable thing that we have from an ecosystem service market perspective. But I just want to do a quick call of, after the two projects, what's resonating or running through any of the dolphins' heads as we think about what this reveals, whether for these projects or other projects that you've been working with or aware of in recent weeks or months or years.
I'm struck by the multiple benefits that each of these projects encompasses. And while that, I think, long run will hopefully serve them well, is maybe a challenge in the short term. How do you sort of gear messaging to the audience who might be best suited for this slice of funding or that slice of funding? And Margaret was saying that about the Lachlan's project, targeting the messaging to suit the audience is important, but at the end of the day, you need funding for the entirety of the project. And it's just a big challenge when you have projects that hit on a lot of different needs, and the funding sources are so disparate, unfortunately.
I would agree with that, and I was thinking about I've been doing a lot of work on, helped convene a meeting on using nature for both climate resilience and climate mitigation, and how in the kind of new world we are in, of kind of a climate impacted world, nature is so important because it helps build resilience while mitigating at the same time. Both of these are planting trees, which are kind of gives you a twofer, but our regulatory systems and our financing systems and everything are all set up in very small silos, and nature is breaking it down. So we're trying to kind of shake loose the change at the intersections, and that's hard, but we've got to figure out how to build those revenue streams.
And the one other thing I was struck by too is two incredibly different contexts, but so many similarities between the two and similar challenges. I mean, two totally different sides of the world, different scales, different, density challenges, different
urban, rural. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just, there's so many, you can go on and on, but there were so many core commonalities, and just seems like, it just reaffirming that we need to continue to try and find ways to come up with revenue streams and find ways to get more of these projects done, especially now as increased funding is coming available, not just on the grant side, but also on the financing side, so we can actually unlock it for these types of projects.
Yeah, I have a half a thought. I don't know if it's at all constructive or useful for this audience, but just that point about, as much thought as there is about integrating the carbon market and kind of continuing that push, I'm very much struck by that seems to be the only readily monetizable stream for any projects like this. And though very much imperfect, the challenge back to those who are kind of maybe trying to write off the whole carbon market on the basis of a couple either bad actors or kind of early imperfect actors, as the case may be, is, what else have we got? We've got state appropriations, we've got federal infrastructure bill, perhaps here in the US, but really just thinking about the kind of time it takes for market maturation to occur in the context of where carbon has come from, but then, to what extent those cash flows from water or from, what am I trying to say, from biodiversity credits and some of the kind of current debate in a biodiversity credit market startup climate, how near-term and real those may be. So again, not a real concrete thought there to offer up, but just a general musing on market maturation.
I think you could add the health benefits for the first project as well to that list of immature solutions. I was disheartened to see the philanthropic, like corporate philanthropic number for the Detroit project being relatively small. It seems like such an obvious thing for corporates and particularly health-oriented corporates to be investing in local communities.
Yeah, we don't have a way to monetize urban heat island mitigating factors, but the science is very clearly established, right? Like we've had, a decade or two of studies coming out saying the value of each individual urban tree is something to the order of $6,000 of either cooling or kind of heat capturing benefits, depending on what, if you're trying to warm or cool a city. Some of the other things in terms of cleaner air and let alone factoring in kind of the mental health benefits of the green space. Well, I think we can put a pin in it there. I really want to thank Lachlan, Eric, and Seth especially. It takes a lot to come present your work in this format. It's much easier to recruit the dolphins than it is to find the projects who are brave enough to come swim. So really just want to thank Eric, Seth, and Lachlan for bringing their projects forward today. And also very much to Jill, Sean, Jessamine, and Margaret for joining us, for sharing such incredible insight, expertise, and thoughts and insight on funding and financing strategies. That is a wrap for the Learning Lab webinar series. We're so pleased that so many of you have joined us for the duration. This was also recorded and will be shared shortly on the Hysted website, along with the other recordings for those that anyone may have missed. And from the Conservation Finance Network's perspective, we just want to again shine a spotlight on Hysted and all of their great work to enable capacity building and community building in this learning environment across the conservation finance community, centered in New England, but extending those benefits not just across the country, but as we've seen today, around the globe. So I just want to say thank you from where we sit, and hopefully we will see you again next year for a third iteration of the Learning Lab series. Thank you again, folks. Take care.